Hi guys, this is Dr. Gonzalez, and today I'm going to take you through sources of information. So we're going to talk about different places that you can get information as a researcher, the pros and the cons of the information that you might find there, how to do a good search. But we're going to start, before we get into that, about how you as a researcher have to critically evaluate the sources that you're going to use and some of the more philosophical things behind that. So first, let's talk about the differences between research and personal experience. So I have two images up here. One of these is supposed to represent a clinical trial, right? And in a clinical trial, you've got many participants before that drug is approved. And there's a reason why they do that. They do that to get a lot of different people's experience with the medication or the drug, and also to test things like the efficacy, the whether or not it works, just lots of really clinical data. And I put the other picture up here of a pill bottle, which is representing your personal experience. So you taking a medication, you have a personal experience with it, but it may not be anything like the experience that participants had during the clinical trial. So research is quite different from personal experience. Experience is a human condition, and your experience in life is very unique. It does not have a comparison group. My experiences and your experiences are similar in many ways. I was a psychology student at one point in time. I took a research methods class, but our experience going through those things is individual and it's very different. Part of the problem is because personal experience is confounded. There are so many different variables that have influenced my experience and that are influencing your experience right now. So when we're talking about data on a clinical trial, for example, on how well a medication works, experience has too many confounds, therefore research has to be better. So let's talk about how comparison works with that, because comparison is what we get through research. Your personal experiences are unique. You see the world through your own perception. And the problem with that is that any one person's personal experience is falsifiable. I can go out there and look at your experience, and I can find some variable that will falsify what you have experienced in any particular situation. And that is a reality of the human condition. So research, first of all, provides us with the possibility of making controlled comparisons. And based on those comparisons, I can now calculate probabilities. I can calculate the probability of whether or not you're going to experience a side effect from taking a particular medication. So research accomplishes that by using comparison groups and by doing multiple studies to test those associations. So the bottom line is that your personal experience has no adequate comparison. There is no comparison group, and there's nothing else that I can compare it to. It's not standardized, and more than likely, I'm never going to be able to repeat your personal experience exactly the way it was the first time. So let's talk about confounds, because every day you experience situations and you perceive those situations, right? Your perception of that situation is not necessarily the truth. We can't always determine the exact cause of a particular experience that you have perceived. So here's an example. You go to your favorite restaurant, you've been there a million times before, but this time you have a terrible experience. I don't know what it could be, but let's put it that your food was not exactly the way that you wanted it. It was cold, or it didn't taste as good, whatever. You're just a consumer eating at the restaurant, right? You really don't know if it was just a bad night for the restaurant overall. Maybe they had a lack of staff in the morning to prepare the things that they needed to make your dish, or maybe the ingredients that they're using that day are bad. Those are all alternative explanations for your bad experience, and we call those confounds. And the benefit of research studies is that as a researcher, I can isolate and control for those confounding variables. So, confounds also serve another purpose. Sometimes they actually act as an alternate explanation for the phenomenon that we're studying. When you compare that to personal experience, I can't control for those confounds and any other factors that might be influencing that situation. On the contrary, in research, when I have a very well-designed research study, I can be methodical and follow those steps to the letter, and that allows me to isolate influences. I can include covariables, or I can control things, and those help me hone my focus in on that variable that I'm interested in, the variable of interest. We also have to consider that experience is an exception to the rule. So research is probabilistic, and that means that if I run a research study multiple times, because I have done it multiple times, I'm going to explain everything I can, but there's always going to be exceptions. Now, experience is just one of many cases, but when I do this in a research setting, I'm able to identify patterns. Now, experience doesn't always follow a pattern. So if I haven't collected data, I'm not going to always capture what I need with evidence to be able to support any particular explanation that I'm looking at. Let's talk about research versus human intuition. You know, intuition is that gut feeling, that feeling deep down inside that this is the way it is. And that's a danger in research. So as humans, we're not naturally meant to think in a scientific manner. We often base our decisions, our judgments, on human intuition. And your intuition is a wonderful thing when it comes to like life and death situations, things of that nature. But intuition is often biased, and sometimes you're not even aware that that bias exists. So when we create formal processes of scientific research, we're able to prevent bias, and that bias won't affect our final decision. So you're probably thinking now, well, I didn't know my intuition was biased. So let's talk about how your intuition can be biased. And there's 4 things that we're going to discuss. Being swayed by a good story. Everybody loves a good story, right? Sometimes we can be persuaded by what easily comes to mind or the most popular thing that comes to mind. Sometimes we're biased when we focus on things we expect to find. And sometimes we can even be biased about being biased. And I know that sounds kind of silly, but there's an explanation for it. So, being swayed by a good story. Everybody loves to hear a good story. And we often accept a good story because it makes sense or it sounds good. Everybody likes those feel-good stories. The problem is, you have got to learn to be a good consumer of research so that you can determine if it's just a good story or if there's some basis to it. Research has the goal of proving or disproving an idea. And we're going to go further in depth with that later on when we talk about proving or disproving a hypothesis. So in science, even if the story is good, it doesn't make it true. So I put this example of this book here. A good man is hard to find. Maybe a good man isn't hard to find. I don't know. That was just a short story I found on the internet and thought, oh, I'll put that right here. The second way that intuition can be biased is through something called the availability heuristic. And that is when we are persuaded by what easily comes to mind. So if I asked you, what's the largest killer of Americans each year, you might come up with cancer, or you might come up with heart disease. I don't know. You're probably going to come up with the thing that has influenced your family the most. Cancer seems to be the thing that most people go to Google and search about within this context. So maybe it comes to mind more often than heart disease. But when you look at them statistically, they both kill a very similar number of Americans each year. So that's the availability heuristic. We also said that we can be biased by what we expect to see. Confirmation bias happens when you're looking for an explanation and you find information that agrees with what you already believe. So you're more likely in that situation to do something called cherry picking. Cherry picking is when you select the information or evidence, or you look for information or evidence that supports the way you already think. The next way that intuition can be biased is what we refer to as blind spot bias. So this is the idea that we are biased about being biased. In other words, most of us feel that we're too good to be biased. And this is kind of hard to explain. Like, I struggled finding a good example of it. So I just kind of went to something that wasn't necessarily research-based. So we talk about social media and we talk about misinformation all the time. And you might have this preconceived notion that people on social media are so influenced by misinformation. And that may very well be true, but at the same time, you have to ask your own self, am I influenced by what I read? So am I being influenced by misinformation? The bottom line behind this is that you have to retrain yourself in research to be a scientific reasoner as opposed to an intuitive thinker. So we make mistakes if we base our decisions off of intuition. We want to base them on empiricism. Researchers can create comparison groups and they can look at lots of data in order to come to a conclusion. And you aren't able to do that. We tend to rely on our intuition to make a conclusion, right? Without having data in front of us. So how can you personally change this? You can reduce your cognitive and motivational biases by starting to think scientifically instead of intuitively. So what that means is you have to be an empiricist and you have to look at all of the data presented to you, not just the sources that support your point, not look at stories, not look at intuition, and go with what the data shows you. So where do we go to find information? Some of you are probably already familiar with some of the ways that you can go out and find information in the scientific world. But we're going to focus in this class specifically on how to find information that is going to help us with our final research project, that paper that we're writing. And this is really important because the sources that you use in that paper have to fit a specific criteria set that we're going to establish right now at the beginning of the course, so that when you get to the end, your sources that you based your research question on are going to be reliable. So the first thing I want you to start putting in your mind is that you've got to be a researcher and not just a Googler, okay? I'm old enough to remember when Google was just a thing and not a verb. So you tell people all the time, well, go Google it. Well, that's wonderful. I can use Google to find a lot of scientific information. But if I don't filter that information correctly, I could find myself in a situation where the information that I'm using is not correct. So a strong research paper is going to depend on finding the right sources, understanding them, and then using them strategically in your design of your methodology. So first, we're going to talk about where you're going to go to find the right sources, what is the right source, and then we're going to talk about how to understand them and use them strategically. So the first thing you need to do before you really get into delving into those sources is to stop and think, I've got to be a critical thinker here. I have to consider the source that I'm looking at and consider their authority. So by authority, I mean, are they writing from the point of being an empirical researcher, or are they writing from some other point of view? Even if they're writing from an empirical point of view, the quality of their writing matters as well. So if ideas that are being published out there are only based on experience, intuition, or something else, they could be biased. And the example that your textbook refers to is Gwyneth Paltrow, the actress, and her site, which is called Goop. I've not explored Goop very much in the past few years because I've come to believe that it is a place where people put their opinions about certain things up there and hawk products that they want to sell. So if I were going to go to her website, I would have to keep in mind, are the products being placed on this site and written about, is there efficacy? Is it supported by evidence? Or do people just go to this site and believe whatever is on this site because she's a well-known celebrity? So as a researcher, you've got to consider that authority before you just assume that anything written there should be believed without a grain of salt. Your textbook shows you this graph or this image here that talks about going from this, I believe, whether it's based on authority or based on experience, and you can follow down through here. You've got authority, experience, and research. And what we want to focus on are things that are based on research, because they're going to tend to have scientific sources. They're going to have things like chapters edited in a book, journal articles, or full-length books. And in the end, it's going to give us empirical articles or review articles. This is the avenue that we want to follow. Now, if you were looking for a feel-good story about how somebody beat cancer and survived having breast cancer, then you might want to read something that's based on experience. You're not looking for this type of information in that situation. You're looking for a good story because you want to feel good. So you have to be careful to follow the right train of thought when you're doing research. So before you can get into searching for particular journal articles to support a research question, you need to make sure that you understand the topic that you're talking about. So in this class, this might be a little bit difficult. I'm going to ask you to pick a research question, and you're more than likely going to pick that question based on your curiosity. Or maybe you already got some conceived ideas of what your research or your area of interest might be if you were going to be a researcher. And that's great. But before you can start talking or writing about a deep topic in the research world, you've got to understand that topic, and you have to fundamentally understand it from the basic level so that you can go from basic to more complicated. So when you're thinking about your research question later on in your assignment for this week, I want you to think about stuff that you've already got an understanding of. If you've been doing research in another class about personality, maybe that's something you might want to focus on. Or if you've been studying sleep, maybe that's something that you want to focus on. But whatever you pick for your research question, you need to have some idea of some basic definitions, some key theories, and maybe some major researchers out there that have done research on that. And that's going to help you understand terminology and to be able to identify important concepts. And from that, you're going to generate search terms that are going to be more likely to produce results that are going to be helpful. So those things that we just talked about are things that we consider to be background sources. So background sources, there's two things on this particular slide that I want you to see. There are two primary groups of sources. They can either be background or primary. And background sources are things that help us understand the topic. And that could be a textbook, a review article, an encyclopedia. It may even be just a generic web page. Those are not generally the things that we're going to use in a literature review. And you're going to write a very small literature review to go in your paper. What are you going to include in that literature review? You're going to focus on primary sources. Primary sources are the most important sources that we use in a paper or a research situation. And they include empirical journal articles. And by empirical, I mean they're data-based. They are original studies that a researcher has carried out, and they generally present data and results and then a discussion about that. Primary sources are essential to a good research paper, whether it be your dissertation, your thesis, or just this paper in this class. So just to clarify, in case anybody was concerned, what do you focus on for this class? Focus on primary sources. So that final paper is going to rely on a literature review, a very small one that you've done on peer-reviewed journal articles. So that means you are not going to focus on websites that have, basic information on them or summaries. Last semester, I had a lot of students at the beginning when they were trying to do their literature review that came up with 4 or 5 sources, and 3 out of those 5 sources were web pages. There should not be any websites in your literature review. So to highlight that, I put a picture of the Journal of Neuroscience, which is one of the best journals out there when it comes to the topic of neuroscience. And then I put a picture of a screenshot of the Wikipedia article about neuroscience. Is the Wikipedia article useless? Absolutely not. Wikipedia has come a long way in the past 25 years that I've dealt with it. It's a great place, like an encyclopedia, to go get basic information. Everything you read on Wikipedia, though, you must question. Does it have a source? Is the source reliable? Is it something that actually is proven out there to be true, or did somebody just go edit the page to add some nonsense to it? So good for learning basic concepts and getting an idea? Probably. Good for using in your paper? Journal of Neuroscience. And that's just an example. I'm not saying you all have to have an article from the Journal of Neuroscience. To be a good researcher, though, you need to know how to find those articles. So that means you need to be able to find scientific sources, figure out which ones are legitimate, read that research, and then discern whether it's journalism or disinformation versus legitimate research. So we're going to talk about how we do that in a little bit. So in psychology, journal articles are the gold standard. There are 2 major types. We have empirical journal articles and we have review journal articles. Empirical articles will report the method and results from a research study that someone has conducted, and that this is the first time those results are being published. Okay? This is something we carried out in a lab or in a place, a situation of research, university, whatever. We collected this data, we analyzed this data, and now we're presenting this data to the world for the first time. Review journal articles are not as legitimate as those empirical articles because what they do is they summarized previous studies, plural, that have been conducted in a certain area of research. They're legitimate and they have a purpose, but they're not necessarily that first publication of that data. Now, where do you go to get these articles? Normally, you can Google a topic and find reliable, for the most part, information. Researchers just can't go to Google and do a general internet search. We need to use the academic tools that are specifically out there for academic databases. And a few examples are PsycInfo, Medline, dissertation databases, and Google Scholar. And for this class, we're going to really focus on PsycInfo and Google Scholar. Those are the 2 places that you're going to use to find your articles when it comes time for you to find them for your literature review. So, why are academic databases so important? Well, they're important for a few reasons. First of all, you can filter on the database for what we call peer-reviewed research. And this is research that has been done by a researcher in a legitimate research setting, and it's been prepared for publication and submitted to a journal. Once it's submitted to the journal, a group of scientists sit down and they go through what's called the peer review process. They review the methodology, the way the data was collected, the way it was analyzed, and the discussion of that article, and they critique it, and they look for places where it may not have been up to par for that journal's editorial standards. So they might recommend that the researcher do some more research. They may ask for clarification, or they may accept it for publication as it is. More than likely, it's going to be kicked back to the researcher, and there's some questions that need to be answered before they will proceed with publication. Another reason why those academic databases are important is because they're more accurate than Google. They're going to, by the nature of being academic databases, not include things like Wikipedia. And then the other thing is that you have the way of customizing your search based on keywords, based on authors, based on topics. So you can make it to what you need your search to be. So journal articles, both empirical and review, they come in journals and they come out monthly or quarterly. They're written for a specific audience, and that audience is the researchers of that field of study. They're comprised of empirical and review articles, and they go through that peer review process. Some examples: the Lancet Psychiatry, Nature Human Behavior, Child Development, and the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. Those are just 4 out of hundreds that exist. Another academic source that you might use, probably not for this particular class, but if you were writing a thesis or a dissertation, you might find books or book chapters that summarize a field of research or a subset of that field. And these usually include articles that have been edited by one or more authors. So the book itself may not be written by, Joe Johnson, but there's a chapter in that book written by Joe Johnson. And a couple of examples that I have there are the Handbook of Special Education, and then a book called Unraveling Dyslexia, A Guide for Teachers and Families. And those are books that you could Google and find. There are sources out there that are what we consider to be less scholarly. So a book written for general audiences just applies a principle to real life. You've got to be careful and look at the references and citations to determine if the quality of that book is worthy of your time, especially if you're talking about something within the research perspective. So Statistics Essentials for Dummies. It's a great book if you need help with statistics, but it might not be the place that you want to go to cite something for a research paper. Wikis, same thing. Just be careful. Wikis often don't have updated references, and that can be a bad thing. You also have to be careful of what is the popular press. So these might provide you with interesting information about a topic, but you need to check publication sources, references, and citations because their purpose is to tell a story. So examples would include newspapers, magazines, blogs, or news websites. So where are you going to go? Well, there's going to be a separate video in Canvas that's going to walk you through how to do your preliminary search for your research paper. But it's going to direct you to our library. And in the library, it's going to ask you to isolate to one particular search engine. And that search engine is going to be the PSYC info database. It is updated by the American Psychological Association, and it specifically works with psychology resources. Now, just because you're querying a database of high reputation doesn't mean that you can drop your guard. You still have to use the right keywords, and you have to exercise caution because the quality of the search engine matters, and how you put your search terms in matters. And you want to be careful out there to be wary of paywalled versus open source articles. You have access to a ton of articles by the nature of being a UHCL student. A regular person who was not associated with the university would be subject to paywalls on that. You'd have to pay to get those articles. And that's because while you're in university, we assume that you're a researcher, right? So the university pays for that access. Be careful because some journals are predatory, and they will basically accept anybody for publication as long as those people are willing to pay. Another way that you can find sources is to visit a researcher's website. So say you found a researcher for your particular research topic, and they are like the number one person out there for that particular aspect of research, and you're stuck and you can't find anything else, you're having like a moment of brain freeze and you need some inspiration. Researchers usually publish their CV, their curriculum vitae, and you can go find the names of other publications that they have published. You can then go back to EBSCO or Google Scholar or APA and find other journals that they have written, other journal articles they've written. Another source that is out there today that we didn't have 30 years ago is Google Scholar. It's free, has a simple interface, and you can find articles on it as well. But you've got to be a little careful with Google Scholar because they tend to have articles that are not always peer-reviewed. They also include some journals that are considered to be predatory, or some of the material that you might find is not exactly scholarly material. So how do you get a search engine to give you what you need? Well, searching is not a random thing. It's a skill. And you got to learn to be strategic about it, and you're going to use certain strategies. The specific strategies that I tend to use are using specific terms, not vague language, using synonyms, and then adjusting your wording. So if you're interested in something that has to do with families and adolescents, and you write family problems, that might not get you what you were looking for. You've got to get more specific to something that is applicable to your research question. Maybe you're talking about family therapy and adolescent delinquency. So does going to family therapy associate with decrease in adolescent delinquency? That might be your research question. But you've got to kind of coax the search engine to give you what you need. Another way you can help make that happen is to use Boolean operators. So you add an and to something and it narrows your search. You add an or to something and it broadens your search. The searching is a process. It's an iterative process. That means you're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to have to modify your search, and you might have to do it several times before you get anything useful. A good researcher knows how to revise those search terms, try new combos, and then to refine those results repeatedly over and over again until you find what you need. Another good thing you can do is to build off references. I told you earlier you might find one article and go back to that researcher's CV and find others. If you can find one article written by one researcher, you can often reference the back of their article, the references, and find other articles that they have written themselves, or other articles written by peers in their particular subject area that helps you understand or get to whatever it is that you're looking for. So you look at the reference list, you find related articles, and you follow what's called a citation chain. You can see where Johnson cited Gonzalez's work. Now I find Gonzalez's work and see who Gonzalez has cited. That helps you expand your sources, and it helps you identify key studies in the field. No matter what you're doing out there with your search, you always have to be wary of the quality. Not every source is going to be equal. You should prioritize things that are peer-reviewed and are journal articles. You also want to look to see how well they've been cited. Have other people cited that article? The higher the citations usually is an indicator of the better quality that it is. You also want to go with established journals. If it's a journal that just popped up last year, I would be very weary of that. That would be maybe a weak or unknown journal. You need to make sure that those journals are peer-reviewed, and be careful for biased or unsupported claims. Just because you find something through a search doesn't mean you should use it. There have been many times where I'm doing a search and I find something totally interesting, but totally not related to what I'm doing. So I put that in a pile of things to look at later because they don't have anything to do with what I'm doing at the moment. They might later, I don't know, but for now they go into a pile. So once you've found those sources, what do? How do you read them? Well, you need to have a strategy. You need to have a strategy to help you read them in the best way possible. So journal articles are generally made in the same way. They have an abstract that summarizes the study. There's an introduction that explains the background and provides a thorough review of the literature that they used to create their research methodology. And they're also going to list in that introduction their specific goals or hypotheses. There's a method section that should explain step by step how the study was conducted. There's a results section that describes the findings that they found. And then there's a discussion section that interprets those findings. The papers usually end with a limitations section that's inside the discussion that says, hey, this was great, all the stuff that we found, but here are the limitations to it. And then they may also include a next steps section in that discussion. And those are great places for finding research questions. At the end, references are listed depending on the way that the journal uses their creates their citations. We're looking at APA, and we'll cover that in a whole nother presentation later on. So once you've pulled those sources, you're going to need a strategy to read them and to make the experience of reading them manageable and meaningful. So you always start with the abstract because it gives you a quick summary of the study. The abstract should tell you the purpose, methods, findings, and significance all in one paragraph. So the first thing you do is read that abstract because it's going to usually become pretty obvious off the bat by reading it whether or not that article is worth your time to going into deeper, like a deeper dive. You need to understand that structure that we just talked about, how most articles follow the MRAD format, which is the introduction, method, results, and discussion. Okay, they generally all follow the same format. Then you need to learn how to read strategically. You're not going to read line by line. First, you're going to read that abstract. Then you're going to look at the introduction and skip to the end and read the conclusion and the discussion. And you might skim the methods and results section if you need more detail or if you're questioning something that they did and you want to know how they did it. While you're reading, annotation is your friend. You want to highlight things that are jumping out at you, the key findings or important quotes. I am a big believer in printing out the articles because I just like to have that tactile experience of jotting down questions or highlighting unfamiliar terms or writing my thoughts down in the margin. And then you might want to create a brief summary after each section. So you might need to open up a Word document while you're doing this. I can give you 100 suggestions, but you have to work with what works for you. When you're reading, you're going to be especially critical about the methods and results section. You want to make sure that the researcher didn't make an overgeneralization or that they didn't control for something. So you're going to ask yourself questions like, was the sample size large enough? Are the methods appropriate for the research question? Do they support the conclusions that the researcher made? And you're going to generally be cautious of things that are overgeneralizations or show a lack of control for bias. And I know a lot of that probably sounds foreign to you right now, and that's okay. This is just things that I had to include because they're good policy, they're good practice, right? You might not be able to employ all of these in your literature review for this paper. After you've decided that an article is worth your time, you might want to go back and look at the graphs and tables. You don't want to skip over the figures because usually they summarize the data in a very good way. You want to make sure you understand the variables that they're looking at, what the different axes represent on a graph, and then look at the statistics that they ran. Look at the symbols or the significance levels, like their p-values. Remember, this is the third time I've mentioned it in this presentation, but the reference list can be a treasure trove of more articles. And it's not just things that have furthered that particular body of information. It can actually take you backwards to help finding foundational studies. Those would be really important if you were doing a dissertation. After you've read an academic source, you want to make sure you summarize it in your own words. That's going to help you later on when you go to write your own literature review. I got to throw the warning in here about AI because it'd be really tempting to just throw that article in ChatGPT and have them summarize it for you, but that's not going to do anything for you to retain what the article was really about. And if you're going to go to grad school and write a dissertation, you've got to be able to do this. You're not going to have ChatGPT there when you're defending your dissertation. You always want to be critical too. So you want to question everything and don't take every claim at face value. You want to look at who funded a research study. Did they declare any conflicts of interest? And then the big one is that a peer-reviewed journal, or was it just some fly-by-night publication out there? So when you're looking at empirical journal articles, make sure you're looking at their argument and the evidence to support their argument. And the same thing can be said for chapters and review articles. You want to be able to discriminate between journalism and legitimate journalism and disinformation. So science is something we encounter in the popular media every day. Like right here, this is a screenshot from Good Morning America that says something about 18 to 30-year-olds are growing horns. Okay, I don't even want to begin with that, because the last time I checked, none of my students that I teach in high school have horns. But they took a thing that was found out there in a study, and they changed it to fit their narrative. And that is a form of disinformation. So just be weary of what you're reading and be critical. Question everything. Be careful when it comes to disinformation. You've got to consider people's motivation for disinformation. Usually the P's: propaganda, passion, politics, provocation or rage baiting, and then profit. And be careful with the different types of disinformation that are out there. So where has this taken us? It's taken us to the point where I want to prepare you for writing a literature review. A literature review is a review of the pertinent literature to a particular research question. And you're going to use what we call a meta-analysis process to do that. So you're going to look at multiple databases, look at multiple keyword combinations. You're going to include some things and exclude others, and you're going to systematically review your articles. And you want to remember that good research is transparent. So as a researcher, you should be able to explain how you found your studies and why you included some and excluded others. After you have found your sources, you organize them. You summarize each article. You're going to identify their research question, their basic methods, their results, and their limitations. And that's going to help prepare you for writing and then later on developing a thesis statement. Common things that students do that don't help them with their literature review is first using weak sources. And the way you can avoid that is stick with PsycInfo and Google Scholar. Don't use websites, and remember to focus on peer-reviewed journal articles. The second one is the journal articles you find are only going to be as good as your search terms. So when you search poorly, you don't find what you need. So you need to use specific terms, not vague or incorrect terms. Next, you want to make sure you've read thoroughly. Make sure you've got more than one or two sources. Your literature review for this particular project, I'm going to put at 5 to 8 sources. So you are going to need 5 to 8 articles that you can write from in justifying why you want to do the research that you're proposing in your research paper. Another thing that students often do is not understand the articles to a sufficient level. You don't want to just skim them. You want to read with comprehension. And while you're reading, remember you're taking notes and you're making annotations, because those things help you organize your information. Your information is going to have a flow. So points to remember: start with good background knowledge. You might get that from textbooks. Make sure you're using peer-reviewed journal articles as your main sources. Search databases, academic databases, right? Not just Google. Use precise keywords, refine them because it's an iterative process. Make sure you follow reference lists to find more research or the researcher's CV. Make sure you're constantly evaluating the quality of those sources. Summarize and organize what you've read, and expect this process to take a little bit of time and a little bit of iteration. Now, for that, this is a summer course. When I'm making this particular video, it goes fast. We've got a week to do this, so take everything I've said with a grain of salt, and we're going to do the best we can with the time we have. If you have any questions about that, you can email me, and most of this information came from Morling Chapter 2, and then a couple of chapters out of the Baldwin How to Write a Research Paper book. There will be a specific thing in Canvas that will tell you exactly what chapters need to be read for this particular subject here. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out. Take care.